Hi, today we're talking to Christina Thompson, editor of Harvard Review and the author of Come on Shore and We Will Kill and Eat You All, which is a fabulous title.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
And first of all, we're going to do our cocktails. So what have we got?
This is a Grand Rum Toddy.
Okay.
Comes from Frank in New Zealand.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, you ready?
Yep.
All right. Shot of rum.
Okay.
So we're going to do 2. We're going to try and divide this equally. Mm-hmm. Do you think that was equal? Let's go back to the first one.
You may got a little more than me, maybe.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I got more rum than you did. That's good. Then we have a half shot of Grand Marnier.
Okay.
Which
it smells delicious.
Smells good.
Ah.
Okay, and now we have a third of a shot of lime juice.
Okay.
I think I got more lime too. Ooh, definitely got more lime.
It smells like snow and winter days and crackling fires is what it makes me think of.
All right. Well, we have hot water to fill.
Just fill, okay.
I think we're going to fill it really, but...
Okay, and if you want it...
Let's call it like that, yeah?
I suppose it depends how strong you want it as to how much you put in.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. Let's stop it there. Wait.
Oh my gosh, the smell.
Now you get... here. You get your
Okay.
wedge.
I'm going to squeeze and then drop.
All right. And I get my wedge. Oh, I think you were supposed to stir first.
That's all right, we can stir now.
Let's stir. I think you might want your water boiling.
Yes, I think it would be lovely if it was steaming.
All right.
Okay. Oh my God.
You ready? Cheers. Whoa.
Oh. Okay, the smell is stronger than the taste.
Yep.
There isn't a catch at the back of the throat, but I mean, it's quite strong. But it's not like drinking neat alcohol. I thought it was going to be...
It's a lot of lime.
Oh, you got more lime.
I think I did. I got most of the lime.
Well, that's nice. I like it. Good. Okay. So let's talk first about, for any writers who are out there, let's go to Harvard Review. And I know people can go to is it harvard.org?
It's harvardreview.org.
harvardreview.org.
Yep.
And find out all about submissions.
Right.
But if someone is an emerging author, are they likely to be published by you?
So Harvard Review, which is about 20 years old, is published by Harvard University, actually by the library at Harvard University, Houghton Library. And we publish twice a year in book form. And we publish very established writers. We published John Updike. We published Arthur Miller before he died, which was a great...
Wow.
We published Gore Vidal,
Wow.
also before he died. We've published a lot of very famous writers, but we also publish emerging writers. And we have, in many of our issues, published people who have never been published before, which is truly the most exciting part of the whole thing.
That is exciting. And
Yeah.
I do know that you are one of the few journals who still, not to everyone, but still respond to writers when you've liked a story but it didn't quite make it.
We do respond to writers, but we also have a bad reputation of being really slow.
Okay. Well,
And
fair enough.
we're really slow because there are only 2 of us.
Right.
And so we read everything, but we have a big backlog.
Yes.
So I always just encourage people to be patient.
Okay. And can people submit to other places at the same time?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
And
that's fine.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if anybody ever writes to me and says, I've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, holding my story, waiting to publish, waiting to send it someplace else, I say, oh, no.
Send it out.
Send it out.
Yes.
Because I don't want to be responsible for delaying them.
No. And do you ever have people withdrawing their submissions because they've been published?
Constantly.
Yeah. So that's tiresome because then you've read the piece.
Yeah, but that's okay. That's the price of being slow.
Yes.
So I don't mind that. I think that it's all part of the give and take of the process, you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also you're teaching at the Harvard
Yes.
Extension School.
Yes, I also teach. I teach in the writing program at Harvard Extension, which means that I teach 2 kinds of classes. I teach an editing class, and I teach a narrative nonfiction, or literary creative nonfiction, or whatever you want to call it. Okay. And sometimes that comes under the rubric of journalism, and sometimes it comes under creative writing, and occasionally they put it as an XPOS class. And
Okay. And then what about, I know you've been doing something with college students, college essays.
I have. This year I started, because I had a high school senior who needed help. I thought, well, all his friends need help too. So I started helping high school seniors with their college applications, just with the essay part of it. I'm only interested in the essay.
Just the essay.
Just the essay.
And so when should they come to you?
Well, I think ideally early in the fall. It's possible. This spring I'm going to experiment with seeing some kids in the spring, but I think people get a little too excited about it too early.
Do you?
I do.
What about the summer? Do you think?
Summer would be fine.
Perfect.
Summer would be fine. But early in the fall, unless they're extremely busy, if they're so
Right.
busy that they can't think about it in the fall, that's bad.
Yes.
But otherwise, I think early in the fall, everybody kind of gears up for the process and they start to think about it. And they're a little more mature. They have a little more experience behind them. They have a few more experiences.
Maybe summer
They have a
experiences to
summer
talk
experience, exactly.
My daughter actually did hers in the summer because I was so nervous that she would be too busy in September, and I just wanted her to get it out of the way.
A lot of people feel that way, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. And I had a lot of kids who were doing it, on into November and even December.
Yes, yeah, sure. Yeah.
So I don't think that the pressure is bad. In some ways, it focuses the mind.
Yes, that's true.
So
That's true.
it was okay if they came in the fall.
And do they have to be in Boston? Do they have to be able to come and see you?
No, they don't. I have some students who are not in Boston. I like to have some FaceTime with them, but we can do it on Skype.
Okay.
So a little FaceTime is good, and then we do the essays by email.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and I think it's surprisingly helpful. They make a lot of mistakes in strategy.
Oh, yeah.
Strategy mainly.
And some people don't know how to even begin the whole process, so that can be...
Yeah, they don't know what's a good topic.
Okay, so can people contact you through, is it comeonshore.com?
Yes, or ChristinaThompsonEditorial.com.
Okay.
Which is really kind of where my editorial home is. But
Okay.
either way,
Okay, so
even
we
at
can
Harvard
find
Review.
you. Okay, so now let's talk about the book, Come on Shore, and We Will Kill and Eat You All. A fabulous title. Did you come up with that?
I stole it.
Yeah.
I stole it from Charles Darwin,
Okay.
who stole it from Captain Cook.
Ah.
So it has a long history and
Yes.
an interesting history, and there's a whole chapter in the book which is really dedicated to the title and where the title comes from and how Darwin took it from Cook and how he also changed it, because it isn't quite what Cook said.
No, I
So-
remember that. So tell us, first of all, how did an academic from Boston end up in Australia and then New Zealand?
Right. So I went after college. I went off and worked as a secretary in the newsroom of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which was kind of a fun job. And then I decided I've got to go back to graduate school. And I decided, for reasons that are now unclear to me, that I would go to Australia. So
why do you think that might have been? Because it's a big world, and a lot of people might choose to go to Europe, to London, to Paris. You
Yeah.
chose Australia.
I think actually the explanation is fairly simple. This was in the 1980s, and there were a lot of, it was the height of the Australian film industry. And there were a lot of great Australian movies, many of them featuring the outback, which I was very drawn to, although I never saw it because I lived in Melbourne, so I never really had any experience with the outback. But
And what was your parents' response?
are you mad?
Was that anything to do with it?
Was that why I went? I don't know. It's a long time ago now. I was an adventurous young person.
Okay, so you ended up...
Also, I'll tell you another thing. I had been to Europe a lot as a young person.
Okay, all
Because
right.
my father taught in Europe in the summers, so I had traveled in Europe a great deal. So it wasn't as though I hadn't been to Florence.
Okay.
So this was there was a lot of novelty in it for me. I'd never been to the Pacific. So off I went, and I enrolled in graduate school at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And then on a trip between Australia and the United States, I stopped in New Zealand because New Zealand's in between, and that was where that's sort of where the story starts.
Okay, and New Zealand, was it very different from Australia? I've not been to New Zealand.
It is culturally not that dissimilar, though all Australians and New Zealanders would hate me for saying that.
Sorry.
It is physically very different.
Right.
It's much greener, it's much smaller, and then it has this large Polynesian population,
Right.
which Australia doesn't have. Australia has an Aboriginal population, but it's a much smaller as a percentage of the total population. So if you live in a city of Melbourne, like Melbourne, it's a very kind of multicultural city, but the multiculturalness of it is Asian and European and
quite
Middle Eastern
sophisticated.
and very sophisticated.
Right.
And New Zealand has a different version of that because it has there are a lot of Tongans and there are a lot of Samoans and it also has a big Asian population, but there's a very different, it's a much more Pacific mix.
Okay.
In New
and
Zealand.
how long were you in Australia?
Almost 15 years, all up.
So did you get an Australian passport?
I did.
You did. So
I
you're
did. I'm a
dual-
naturalized Australian. I'm very proud of that.
Not a and so not New Zealand. You don't have a.
No, I didn't. I didn't live in New Zealand. I never lived in New Zealand.
Okay. So do you miss Australia?
Yes. Yes, I do.
So when you're writing about Australia or New Zealand, it's taking you back to somewhere dear.
Yes, I think so. And when I started writing this book, I had come back to the United States when I started writing it. So I was extremely nostalgic at the time.
Yes. Yeah.
I actually was only a few years back, and
You were
I was
homesick.
quite homesick.
Yes.
I was.
Yeah.
Now I've been back for longer, and I've kind of reverted to my American origin, reverted to type in the sense of becoming more American again.
Right.
Whatever.
Yes. And so when you were there, you went to graduate school, and then you stopped off in New Zealand. Is that where you met your husband?
It is. I met him. I was a tourist, and I was just there for a week on a stopover, and it was Christmas. So it was just after Christmas. So that's the height of the Southern Hemispheric summer. So it was summertime. So I went from snow in New England to the beach in New Zealand, and I was in the north of New Zealand, which is very, very beautiful and beachy.
Oh, so you must have been transported.
I was
Yes,
totally
yeah.
transported. It was
Yes.
absolutely glorious. It was hot.
Yes.
And everything was really interesting
And beautiful.
Beautiful.
Yes,
Beautiful.
That really does something to your senses. Yes.
It was fabulous.
Yeah. So now this book is, in some descriptions, they talk about it as a romance, but it's not a romance in the traditional sense. That it's not the formulaic romance between a man and a woman. Tell us something about what you perceive to be the romantic elements of this book.
Right. This is kind of an interesting point because there were people who said, that's not a love story, but of course it's a love story. It's a love story in a more complex sense, partly because I was in love with the Pacific. I was in love with the history of Australasia. I was in love with the landscape of New Zealand. Of course, I fell in love with my husband when I was there, but I don't go on about that in the book exactly. No. Though I think if you read it, if you're a certain kind of a reader, you understand that I couldn't have this. There's a portrait of a man
Yes.
in this book,
Yes.
which is both, slightly skeptical in some ways, but also really entranced. I was really interested in the background that he came from, the history that he represented, and also the kind of his peculiarities. Which
So you could say you fell in love with the man and his country.
I think so. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the history too. The history of it was a big part of it for me.
Yeah. So one thing that's also interesting for writers is a lot of students will say to me they don't want to reveal everything about their lives.
Right.
And do they have to in order to write a memoir that can be published and can be satisfying?
And
to
the answer
readers?
is no.
The answer is no. You don't have to. No, that's exactly right. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about this book, apart from the fact that it takes you really on a magnificent adventure and leaves you enriched in terms of the knowledge of the culture, the history, is the fact that you can see on Christina's website there are really an array of unusual reviews. People have reviewed this book as a travel writing. They've reviewed it as a memoir. They've reviewed it as an anthropological study. It's really been approached in so many different ways because there are so many elements in it. So when you look back on it, what do you feel it is most of all?
I thought when I was writing it that it was a history. And now I am actually writing a history, and I realize that it's not a history. It's not a history in the sense that it doesn't begin at the beginning of the history and march through to the end of the history. Of a particular time period,
the chronological.
Exactly. And also even to explain how all of these things fit together. It is actually a memoir, but I was very reluctant to use that language. I just didn't feel that the story of me was all that important or interesting. And in hindsight, actually, that's kind of silly because it was a good story. And but what I was really focused on was the relationship between the experiences that I had and what I read about experiences that people had had 100, 200, 250 years ago.
Right.
So that those experiences seem to me to be resonating
Yes.
in the present, even
Yes.
though we were really
Yes.
far
It's time
away.
travel.
Right.
It's time travel.
That's what it is. It's
Yes.
a time travel. That's
It
the
is.
category that it belongs to. Is there a shelf for that in Barnes & Noble?
No, there should be. So I remember there's a part in the book where you do say something, you nail that by saying that you stood and you looked. Do you know the part I'm talking about? Can you describe that?
The part about standing on the beach?
Yes.
Yeah, I used to stand on the beach, and of course the beaches in Australia especially, well, and also parts of New Zealand, are quite empty. I mean, you just don't have that experience if you're from here, from the east coast of the United States. They're just vast and empty and beautiful, and you look out, and I would look out, and I would think about people sailing to these, in ships, sailing to these shores for the first time. And then, of course, it dawned on me that I was seeing it backwards because, of course, they were seeing the shore from sea, and I was looking out and imagining that. And so, what I really should have been imagining was the sight of these little tiny ships sort of coming closer and closer. But I don't know. It was just that sense of arriving in a place for the first time, and also kind of the emptiness of it.
Yeah.
It isn't really that it was empty. These places were populated, but they were very different from an experience that we can have today.
And then tell us about First Contact and the title.
Right. So, and this was actually something that some reviewers objected to because I think they felt that it was an overreach. But I had the feeling, and I still think this is fair, that the experiences that I had when I first got to New Zealand were kind of like first contact experiences.
I mean, for you, they were.
Yeah, they
Yes.
weren't really like first contact experiences. I mean, I knew where I was, and these people, they knew about what kind of person I was, and so forth.
Right, I see what you mean. So tell us, define First Contact.
So first contact is really, in the historical sense, is when you get two groups of people who come together for the first time.
So
you have,
the Maoris
for example,
and the Europeans.
right. So you have Maoris inhabiting New Zealand for 1,000 years, and then kind of one day, Abel Tasman sails into the bay in his two ships, and those people have never met each other before.
And have the Maoris seen a boat such as they were?
No, they've never seen a boat like that. They have never seen people who don't look like them. They've had no contact because they've been very isolated, completely isolated for 1,000 years.
As disturbing as seeing someone from outer space.
It's
in
the
your
alien
garden.
thing. I mean, it's no accident that they appropriated the idea of first contact for science fiction.
Right.
Because that's what it is. It's first contact between people who have no prior experience of one another.
Yes.
Right. So that's not exactly what was happening. If I go into a bar or pub in New Zealand and I meet a bunch of Maoris, I mean, that's not really first contact.
No, right.
But what seemed to me to be the crucial element was that I really did not understand the way they were thinking. And I think they did not understand the way I was thinking. This was a point of contention for some people who said, oh yeah, they know how you were thinking because they've seen a lot of American TV. But I don't really think that counts.
No.
You know, I think that really understanding another culture, there's when people from different cultures come together, that there is a huge gap. And it's much deeper and it's much more profound than I think people expect.
Right.
You know.
So what does this actually mean, we will kill and eat you all? Is that what happened?
So what that has to do with is that's a sort of another stage in the whole thing, which has to do with the fact that when Cook arrived in New Zealand and he sailed around New Zealand, he was the sort of second piece of the first contact story. He arrived in the late 1760s, and he sailed around New Zealand, and everywhere he went, the Maoris would come out in canoes and they would, wave their paddles and they would shout something, which he was able to decode. And the reason he was able to decode it was because he had a Tahitian with him that he'd picked up in Tahiti. So he was actually able to interpret a lot of what the Maoris said. I mean, some of it.
Right.
So what they said is, effectively, come on shore and we'll kill you. Which you can understand would be sort of a...
It's just really like, please don't.
Yeah. Or
we prefer you didn't.
Or if you're going to come here, be prepared to defend yourself.
Right.
Yes. I mean, we are whatever is going on here, this is going to be contested.
Yes.
Right?
So it wasn't to do with cannibalism and you're my next snack.
No, it really wasn't. Although that could have happened, and in fact did happen. I mean, some of the Frenchmen who followed Cook were definitely killed and eaten.
There is some riveting information in here that's quite gruesome and amazing about cannibalism.
Right. Well, it's also the smoked heads and so forth. But so what happened, to finish the thing about the title, so what happened is, so what the Maori said was, okay, come here.
Right.
Yeah. So the next thing that happened was that Charles Darwin, he goes around the world in the Beagle in the 1830s. And when he arrives in New Zealand, he'd been in Tahiti, and he liked Tahiti. He didn't really like New Zealand all that much. He thought it was, I don't know, he didn't like it. So he went on and on and on and on about cannibalism, about Maori cannibalism, because that was just one aspect of a culture that he wasn't very attracted
didn't like
to.
The place.
I think so. And also because it wasn't important. By then you're into the 1830s. It's a very different moment. People are starting to get kind of anxious about this stuff. You're beginning to get a reputation.
Threatened. Did he feel threatened?
Well, you're beginning to get a kind of Victorian British construction of the colonies and of other people and of natives and so forth, which is starting to get darker and darker and darker.
So the stereotyping is really building up.
Correct. And that's also aggravated by the spread of evangelical Christianity across the Pacific and starting to be in that period. Okay, big story. But so what happened was that when Darwin wrote down his responses to New Zealand, he quoted Cook. And he said, well, of course, these people are, they are the most warlike, they are certainly the most warlike people on earth, as evidenced by Cook's experience, that whenever he sailed around these shores, the people came out in canoes and they said, come on shore and we'll kill and eat you all. And so he interpolates the idea of cannibalism into this thing. And you can see that's basically, for me, it was an indication of what happens over time in history. So it's basically a historiographical reading of what happens.
Right, and also when people don't have their own experience of a place.
Right. Well, he was borrowing everything. Yes. I mean, it was second. Well,
no, I mean the development of that idea becoming a big thing, becoming the key feature, if you like, the key character trait.
Well, and it was sensational. I mean, at home in the tabloids, it's sort of
it made good copy.
It's like the way now we hear about people being murdered in other countries, and we go, "Oh my God, those people."
Yes. Yeah. Right. So now, how long did it take you to write this book?
It took me...
You're going to love this. If you're a writer, you're going to love this.
It took me about a decade.
It did, didn't it?
I mean, I wasn't writing every day for a decade.
No.
But it did take me a while to figure out how to pull it together and what to do. And I was doing other things. I was raising children. I was teaching. I was trying to make a living. I was working as the editor of Harvard Review. So I was doing a bunch of things. So...
Yes, a long time. So what was apart from the time frame, what was the hardest thing? What was the worst thing about, or what is the worst thing about writing a book? Because you're writing another one, a 2014 book.
Right.
So what's the hardest thing for you about writing, and how do you overcome it?
I think the big picture is the hard part. For me, it's not sentence to sentence. It's not telling a story. It's not knowing what to write about. It's structure. Especially for a book. Structure is hard. Structure is challenging.
Yes, because you're dealing... I always think that a book length, either a novel or nonfiction, it's like the legs of the octopus. You have to grapple with it and sort of shove it into this shape. Yeah. As opposed to the Michelangelo, just let the shape out, which is very convenient and lovely sounding.
There's also the problem that when you're writing, I always think of this is the push version. When you're writing, you're thinking about all these things you want to get down and want to communicate. Yeah. And then at some point you have to do a second kind of a think, which is, how is my reader experiencing this? Yeah. Does my reader really want to know about whether Alexander Dalrymple was the 11th son of a Scottish baronet? Probably not.
But does that come after the first draft is done?
Oh, yes, it comes after. It comes after.
So is your first draft done now?
No.
No. Okay.
My editor actually said the first draft...
watching this.
Yeah. My editor said recently that the first draft is for the writer and the second draft is for the reader, which I thought was a great way of...
That's a nice way to look at it.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks to Gail Winston for that.
Okay. So what would you say to writers out there who are working on something long and finding it hard? What's an easy way for them to get going again or keep going? Easy. Or what's a way? Easy. But how do you do it? Do you have a writing group? Do you share?
I have a writing group. A writing group helps, I think, because it gives you deadlines. So you say, well, okay, in 3 weeks I have to have another chapter. So that's helpful. you definitely want to not be showing it to too many different people. You need to show to some people, but not to too many people, because everybody will give you a different opinion.
Right, and then it'll send you off to another leg of the octopus.
Right. So that's confusing.
Yeah. So do you give them first draft work?
Yeah.
Okay.
But my first drafts are quite clean.
Yours are. I was going to say, for some writers, that's not a good idea. So first of all, you have to know whether you're comfortable with doing that. And secondly, you have to have some idea of how the people you give it to are going to handle it. If they can respond in a first draft way, which is about very broad strokes, then that's fine. But if they're going to, line edit you in your first draft, then that's not a good choice.
Yeah. I think it's important to be working with people who, either whether you work with them for a longer period of time or for some reason, that you have a real sense of confidence about them and their taste. Because everybody's taste is a little different. Their taste informs their critique, and sometimes they're wrong.
Yes, absolutely.
For
absolutely.
you.
No, that's one of the things that new writers, I think that's one of the hardest things to come to terms with, and that's why I always like to give a piece of writing to at least 3 other people, because then you're going to get completely different responses. But to learn to say, no, I don't agree with that, and just ignore it is really key.
I always find when I'm teaching, because I teach in a workshop, so we have maybe 15 students or something like that, that there are certain kinds of problems that will split the class.
Oh.
And I mean, there are some kinds of issues where the majority, almost everybody will say, "Oh yes, that's a bad idea," or "That's a good idea,"
Right.
and that's easy. That's a done deal. Yeah. And then there's the same thing with the negative. That was a terrible thing to do. Okay, fine. But there are things that split the class, actually split it, and that's interesting.
Is it psychological elements? Is it more about emotion?
I think it has to do with with different kinds of readers.
Yeah.
Some readers are more interested in the kind of emotional undercurrent of the thing, and some readers are more interested in the content and the information.
Yes.
And those are kind of different readers, and they come at a text kind of differently.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and some people also, I think, I try to caution people about very idiosyncratic readings, where people are bringing, if your sister died of cancer, and you read a story in which somebody's sister dies of cancer, you just have a lot that you bring to it, and that you're not a very good critic at that moment, because your relationship is too personal and too
close.
Yeah. So they're not the best readers.
Yeah.
Because they'll say, "Oh, well, that's not what happened to me."
Yes, they make it wrong when it's
as if
not.
That were a critique, which is not a critique. It's just that's not what happened to you.
Yes. Yeah.
So
yeah.
The critique is, would this work for some other? Does the general reader? I mean, I think the general reader.
Yeah. And then with your publishing experience of having this book published and doing the book tour and that kind of thing, is there anything that stands out as did you learn a particular lesson? Is there anything for writers to avoid or be aware of?
I think one of the things that's really hard for writers, and not all writers, it's hard for some people. It's hard for people to not be shy about their work. And I am not a good example of somebody who is able to promote her work very effectively. But there are people, I have seen some people who were really good at being able to advance their own interest. And I admire that. I don't know that you can change, I think it's kind of what kind of a person you are.
Yeah.
I mean, some people just feel that it's really not about them.
Yes.
And the entire... The sort of the universe of publicity and marketing and everything is that it's all about you.
Right.
But some people feel that this is not about me, it's about the book. You read the book, you feel about the book, how you feel about the book, but it's really not about me.
So maybe the takeaway is not to be overly shy and you
just get over it.
Do what you have to do.
Get over it.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's it.
Well, that's it for us today. Thank you very much, Christina.
Cheers.
And comeonshore.com. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.